Hi, my name is Shannon Albright and I have a company called Miss Shannon Sewing, and we're doing a book drive for the children of Selma, Alabama. We're going to fill their library with new books, and right now we have about 500 books that are going to be shipped next week. So here's some of my favorites. I'm going to read you my ultimate favorite book. My love of reading started really in the 3rd grade, where it really took off. I had a teacher in Austin, Texas, named Mrs. Wilborn, and she would read this book to us during reading time, like we had to have circle time. It's Tales of a 4th Grade Nothing, and I love this book so much. I might eventually read the whole thing, but okay, we'll just get started. The Big Winner by Judy Blume. Okay. I won dribble at Jimmy Fargo's birthday party. All the other guys got to take home goldfish in little plastic bags. I won him because I guessed there were 348 jelly beans in Mrs. Fargo's jar. Really, there were 423, she told us later. Still, my guess was the closest. Peter Warren Hatcher is the big winner, Mrs. Fargo announced. At first, I felt bad I didn't get a goldfish too. Then Jimmy handed me a glass bowl. Inside, there was some water and 3 rocks. A tiny green turtle was sleeping on the biggest rock. All of the other guys looked at their goldfish. I knew what they were thinking. They wished they would have had tiny green turtles also. I named my turtle Dribble while I was walking home from Jimmy's party. I live at 25 West 68th Street. It's an old apartment building, but it's got one of the best elevators in New York City. There are mirrors all around. You can see yourself from every angle. There's a soft cushioned bench to sit on if you're too tired to stand. The elevator's operator's name is Henry Bevelheimer. He lets us call him Henry because Bevelheimer's very hard to say. Our apartment is on the 12th floor. But I don't have to tell Henry, he already knows. He knows everybody in the building. He's that smart. He even knows I'm 9 and in 4th grade. I showed him Dribble right away. I won him at a birthday party, I said. Henry smiled. Your mother's going to be surprised. Henry was right. My mother was really surprised. Her mouth opened when I said, just look at what I won at Jimmy Fargo's birthday party. I held up my tiny green turtle. I've already named him Dribble. Isn't that a great name for a turtle? My mother made a face. I don't like the way he smells, she said. What do you mean? I asked. I put my nose right down close to him. I didn't smell anything but turtle. So Dribble smells like a turtle, I thought. Well, he's supposed to. That's what he is. I'm not going to take care of him either, my mother added. Of course you're not, I told her. He's my turtle, and I'm the one that's going to take care of him. You're going to change his water and clean out his bowl and feed him and all of that, she asked. Yes, I said, and even more. I'm going to see to it that he's happy. This time my mother made a funny noise, like a groan. I went into my bedroom. I put Dribble on top of my dresser. I tried to pet him and tell him he would be happy living with me. But it isn't easy to pet a turtle. They aren't soft and furry, and they don't lick you or anything like that. Still, I had my very own pet at last. Later, when I sat down at the dinner table, my mother said, I smell turtle. Peter, go and scrub your hands. Some people might think that my mother is my biggest problem. She doesn't like turtles, and she's always telling me to scrub my hands. That doesn't mean just run them over underwater. Scrub means I'm supposed to use soap and rub my hands together. Then I've got to rinse and dry them. I ought to know by now, I've heard it enough. But my mother isn't my biggest problem. Neither is my father. He spends a lot of time watching commercials on TV. That's because he's in the advertising business. These days, his favorite commercial is the one about Juicy O. He wrote it himself. And the president of the Juicy O company liked it so much, he sent my father a whole crate of Juicy O for our family to drink. It tastes like a combination of oranges, pineapples, grapefruit, pears, and bananas. And if you want to know the truth, I'm getting pretty sick of drinking it. But Juicy O isn't my biggest problem either. My biggest problem is my brother, Farley Drexel Hatcher. He's 2.5 years old. Everybody calls him Fudge. I feel sorry for him. If he's going to grow up with a name like Fudge, but I don't say a word, it's none of my business. Fudge is always in my way. He's messing up everything he sees. And when he gets mad, he throws himself flat on the floor and screams. And he kicks. And he bangs his fist. The only time I really like him is when he's sleeping. He sucks 4 fingers on his left hand and makes a slurping noise. When Fudge saw Dribble, he said, "Ooh, see." And I said, "That's my turtle. Get it? Mine. You don't touch him." Fudge said, "No touch?" Then he laughed like crazy. Chapter 2. Mr. and Mrs. Juicy O. One night, my father came home from the office all excited. He told us Mr. and Mrs. Yarby were coming to New York. He's the president of the Juicy O Company. He lives in Chicago. I wondered if he'd bring my father another crate of Juicy O. If he did, I'd probably be drinking it for the rest of my life. Just thinking about it was enough to make my stomach hurt. My father said he invited Mr. and Mrs. Yarby to stay with us. My mother wanted to know why they couldn't stay at a hotel like most people who come to New York. My father said they could, but he didn't want them to. He thought they'd be more comfortable staying with us. My mother said that was about the silliest thing she had ever heard. But she fixed up Fudge's bedroom for our guests. She put fancy sheets and a brand new blanket on the hide-a-bed. There's a sofa that opens up into a bed at night. It's in Fudge's room because that used to be our den. Before he was born, we watched TV in there, and lots of times Grandma slept over on the hide-a-bed. Now we watch TV in the living room, and Grandma doesn't sleep over very often. My mother moved Fudge's crib into my room. He's going to get a regular bed when he's 3, my mother says. There's a lot of reasons I don't want to sleep in the same room as Fudge. I found that out 2 months ago when my bedroom was being painted. I had to sleep in Fudge's room for 3 nights because the paint smell made me cough. For one thing, he talks in his sleep. And if a person didn't know better, a person could get scared. Another thing is that slurping noise he makes. It's true that I like to hear it when I'm awake. When I'm trying to fall asleep, I like things very quiet. When I complained about having to sleep with Fudge, my mother said, "It's just for 2 nights, Peter." "I'll sleep in the living room," I suggested, "on the sofa, or even on a chair." "No," my mother said, "you'll sleep in your bedroom in your own bed." There was no point in arguing. Mom wasn't going to change her mind. She spent the day in the kitchen. She really cooked up a storm. She used so many pots and pans, Fudge didn't have any left to bang together. That's one of his favorite pastimes, banging pots and pans together. A person can get an awful headache listening to that racket. Right after lunch, my mother opened up the dinner table. We don't have a separate dining room. When we have company for dinner, we eat at one end of the living room. When Mom finished setting the table, she put a silver bowl filled with flowers right in the middle. I said, "Hey, Mom, it looks like you're expecting the president or something." "Very funny, Peter," my mother answered. Sometimes my mother laughs like crazy at my jokes. Other times she pretends not to get them. And then there are times when I know she gets them, but she doesn't seem to like them. This is one of those times. So I decided no more jokes until after dinner. I went to Jimmy Fargo's for the afternoon. I came home at 4 o'clock. I found my mother standing over the dinner table mumbling. Fudge was on the floor playing with my father's socks. I'm not sure why he likes socks so much, but if you give him a few pair, he'll play quietly for hours. I said, "Hi, Mom, I'm home." "I'm missing 2 flowers," my mother said. I didn't know how she noticed that 2 flowers were missing from her silver bowl, because there was at least a dozen of them left. But sure enough, when I checked, I saw 2 stems with nothing on them. "Don't look at me, Mom," I said. "What would I do with 2 measly flowers?" So we both looked at Fudge. "Did you take Mommy's pretty flowers?" my mom asked him. "No take," Fudge said. He was chewing on something. "What's in your mouth?" my mother asked. Fudge didn't answer. "Show Mommy." "No show," Fudge said. "Oh, yes." My mother picked him up, forced his mouth open, and she fished out a rose petal. "What did you do with Mommy's flowers?" She raised her voice. She was really very upset. Fudge laughed. "Tell Mommy." "Yum," Fudge said. "Yummy, yummy, yummy." "Oh no," my mother cried, rushing to the telephone. She called Dr. Cone. She told him that Fudge ate 2 flowers. Mr. Rose must have asked what kind, because my mother said roses, I think, but I can't be sure. One might have been a daisy. There was a long pause while my mother listened to whatever Dr. Cone had said. Then Mom said, "Thank you, Dr. Cone." She hung up. "No more flowers," she told Fudge. "You understand?" "No more," repeated Fudge. "No more, no more, no more." My mother gave him a spoonful of peppermint-flavored medicine, the kind I take when I have stomach aches. Then she carried Fudge off to his bath. Leave it to my brother to eat flowers. I wonder how they tasted. Maybe they're delicious, and I don't know it because I've never tasted one, I thought. I decided to find out. I picked off 1 petal from a pink rose. I put it in my mouth and tried to chew it up. But I couldn't do it. It tasted awful. I spit it out right in the garbage. At least now I know I wasn't missing anything great. Fudge ate his supper in the kitchen before our company arrived. While he was eating, I heard my mother remind him, "Fudgy's going to be a good boy tonight. Very good for Daddy's friends." "Good," Fudge said. "Good boy." "That's right," my mother told him. I changed and scrubbed up while Fudge finished his supper. I was going to eat with the company. Being 9 has its advantages. My mother was all dressed up by the time my father got home with the Yarbys. You'd never have guessed my mom spent most of the day in the kitchen. You'd also never have guessed that Fudge ate 2 flowers. He was feeling fine. He even smelled nice, like baby powder. Mrs. Yarby picked him up right away. I knew she would. She looks like a grandmother. That type always makes a big deal of Fudge. She walked into the living room, cuddled him, then sat down on the sofa and bounced Fudge around on her lap. "Isn't he the cutest little boy?" Mrs. Yarby said. "I just love babies." She gave him a big kiss on the top of the head. I was waiting for somebody to tell her Fudge was no baby, but no one did. My father carried the Yarby suitcase into Fudge's room. When he came back, he introduced me to our company. "This is our older son, Peter," he said to the Yarbys. "I'm 9 and in the 4th grade," I told them. "How do, Peter?" Mr. Yarby said. Mr. Yarby just gave me a nod. He was still busy with Fudge. Wait, Mrs. Yarby just gave me a nod. She was still busy with Fudge. "I have a surprise for you, dear little boy," she said. "It's in my suitcase. Should I go get it?" "Yes," Fudge shouted. "Go get, go get." Mrs. Yarby laughed as if it was the biggest joke she'd ever heard. "I'll be right back," she told Fudge. She put him down and ran off to find her suitcase. She came back carrying a present tied up with a red ribbon. "Ooh," Fudge cried, opening his eyes wide. "Goody!" He clapped his hands. Mrs. Yarby helped him unwrap his present. It was a wind-up train that made a lot of noise. Every time it bumped into something, it turned around and went the other way. Fudge liked it a lot. He likes anything that makes noise. I said, "That's a nice train." Mrs. Yarby turned to me and said, "Oh, I have something for you too, Peter." Oh, wait, hold on. "Oh, I have something for you too, Peter," I reminded her. "My name is Peter." "Yes, well, I'll go get it." Mrs. Yarby left the room again. This time she came back with a flat package. It was wrapped up too, red ribbon and all. She handed it to me. Fudge stopped playing with his train long enough to come over and see what I got. He took the paper off very carefully. I took the paper off very carefully in case my mother wanted to save it. And also to show Mrs. Yarby that I'm much more careful about things than my brother. I'm not sure she noticed. My present turned out to be a big picture dictionary, the kind I liked when I was about 4 years old. My old one is in Fudge's bookcase now. Excuse me. "I don't know much about big boys," Mrs. Yarby said. So the lady in the store said a nice book would be a good idea. A nice book would have been a good idea, I thought, but a picture dictionary, that's for babies. I've had my own regular dictionary since I was 8. But I knew I had to be polite, so I said, "Thank you very much. It's just what I've always wanted." "I'm so glad," Mrs. Yarby said. She let out a long sigh and sat back down on the sofa. My father offered the Yarbys a drink. "Good idea. Good idea," Mr. Yarby said. "What'll it be?" my father asked. "What'll it be?" Mr. Yarby repeated, laughing. "What do you think, Hatcher? It'll be Juicy-O. That's all we ever drink. Good for your health." Mr. Yarby pounded his chest. "Of course," my father said, like he knew it all along. "Juicy-O for everyone." My father told my mother. She went into the kitchen to get it. While my father and Mr. Yarby were discussing Juicy-O, Fudge disappeared. Just as my mother served everyone a glass of Mr. Yarby's favorite drink, he came back. He was carrying a book, my old worn-out picture dictionary, the same one the Yarbys just gave me. "See?" Fudge said, climbing up on Mrs. Yarby's lap. "See book?" I wanted to vanish. I think my mother and father did too. "See book?" Now Fudge held it up over his head. "I can use another one," I explained. "I really can. This one's falling apart." I tried to laugh. "It's returnable," Mrs. Yarby said. "It's silly to keep it if you already have one." She sounded insulted, like it was my fault she bought something I already had. "Mine," Fudge said. He closed the book and held it tight against his chest. "Mine, mine, mine." "It's the thought that counts," my mother said. "It was so nice of you to think of our boys." Then she turned to Fudge. "Put the book away now, Fudgy." "Isn't it Fudgy's bedtime?" my father hinted. "Oh, yes, I think it is," my mother said, scooping him up. "Say goodnight, Fudgy." "Good night, Fudgy," my brother said, waving at us. Fudge was supposed to fall asleep before we sat down to dinner. But just in case, my mother put a million little toys in his crib to keep him busy. I don't know who my mother thought she was fooling, because we all know Fudge can climb out of his crib anytime he wants. He stayed away until we were in the middle of roast beef. Then he came in carrying Dribble's bowl. He walked right up to Mrs. Darby. He thought she was his new friend. "See," he said, holding Dribble under her nose. "See Dribble?" Mrs. Yarby shrieked, "Oh, I can't stand reptiles! Get that thing away from me!" Fudge looked disappointed. So he showed Dribble to Mr. Yarby. "See?" he said. "Hatcher!" Mr. Yarby boomed. "Make him get that thing out of here!" I wondered why Mr. Yarby called my father Hatcher. Doesn't he know his first name is Warren? And I didn't like the way Mr. and Mrs. Yarby both called Dribble a thing. I jumped up. "Give him to me," I told Fudge. I took Dribble and his bowl and marched into my room. I inspected my turtle all over. He seemed all right, But I didn't want to make a big scene in front of company, but I was mad. I was really mad. That kid knows he's not allowed to touch my turtle. Peter, my father called, come and finish your dinner. When I got back to the table, I heard Mrs. Yarby say, it must be interesting to have children. We never had any ourselves. But if we did, Mr. Yarby told my father, we'd teach them some manners. I'm a firm believer in good old-fashioned manners. So are we, Howard, my father said in a weak voice. I thought Mr. Yarby had a lot of nerve to hint that we had no manners. Didn't I pretend to like their dumb old picture dictionary? If that isn't good manners, then I don't know what is. My mother excused herself and carried Fudge back into my room. I guess she put him in his crib again. I hope she told him to keep his hands off my things. We didn't hear from him again until dessert. Just as Mother was pouring coffee, he ran in wearing my rubber gorilla mask from last Halloween. It was a very real looking mask. I guess that's why Mrs. Yarby screamed so loud. If she hadn't made so much noise, my mother probably wouldn't have spilled the coffee all over the floor. My father grabbed Fudge, pulled the gorilla mask off him. That's not funny, Fudge, he said. Funny, Fudge laughed. Funny, 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 funny Fudgy. Yes, Sir Hatcher, Mr. Yarby said. Old-fashioned manners. By that time, I'm sure my father was sorry the Yarbys weren't staying at a hotel. I finally got to bed at 10. Fudge was in his crib, slurping away. I thought I'd never fall asleep, but I guess I did. I woke up once when Fudge started babbling. He said, boo ba mum mum ha ba she. Whatever that means. I didn't even get scared. I whispered, shut up. And he did. It's kind of rude to tell someone to shut up, but it's all right. They're brothers. Early the next morning, I felt something funny on my arm. At first, I didn't wake up. I just felt this little tickle. I thought it was part of my dream. But then I had the feeling somebody was staring at me, so I opened my eyes. Fudge was standing over me, and Dribble was crawling all over my arm. I guess Fudge could tell I was getting ready to kill him because he bent down and kissed me. That's what he does when my mother's angry at him. He thinks nobody can resist him when he makes himself so lovable. And a lot of times it works with my mother, but not with me. I jumped up, put Dribble back in his bowl, and I smacked Fudge on the backside hard. He hollered. My father came running into my room. He was still in his pajamas. He whispered, what's going on in here? I pointed at Fudge, and he pointed at me. My father picked up my brother and carried him off. Go back to sleep, Peter, he said. It's only 6 o'clock in the morning. I fell asleep for another hour, then woke up to an awful noise. It was Fudge playing with his new train. It woke everybody, including the Yarbys. But this time there was no one they could blame. They were the ones who gave Fudge the train in the first place. Breakfast was a very quiet affair. Nobody had much to say. Mr. Yarby drank 2 glasses of juicy O. Then he told my father that he and Mrs. Yarby had their suitcases packed. They were leaving for a hotel as soon as breakfast was over. My father said he understood, that the apartment's too small for so many people. My mother didn't say anything. When Mr. Yarby went to Fudge's bedroom to pick up his suitcase, his voice boomed, Hatcher! My father ran into the bedroom. My mother and Mrs. Yarby followed him. I followed them. When we got there, we saw Fudge sitting on the Yarby suitcase. He had decorated it with about 100 green stamps, the kind that my mother gets at the supermarket. See? Fudge said. See? Pretty. He laughed. Nobody else did. Then he licked the last green stamp and stuck it in the middle of the suitcase. All gone, Fudge sang, holding up his hands. It took my mother half an hour to peel off her trading stamps and clean up the Yardies' suitcase. The next week, my father came home from the office and collected all the cans of Juicy O in our house. He dumped them into the garbage. My mother felt bad that my father had lost such an important account. But my father told her not to worry. Juicy O wasn't selling very well at the stores. Nobody seemed to like the combination of oranges, grapefruits, pineapples, pears, and bananas. You know, Dad, I said, I only drank Juicy O to be polite. I really hated it. You know something funny, Peter? My father said. I thought it was pretty bad myself. So the next chapter is the family dog. I'm going to stop here because I'm getting a little bit tired. But this book will be at your library in Selma. I hope you check it out, and I hope you love this book and love reading as much as I do.